Hello and welcome to episode 77 of On Liberty, coming to you live from the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm your host, Salvatore Babonis, and joining me today is our own Glenn Fahey, Research Fellow in Education Policy at the Center for Independent Studies and sometimes host of the CIS's flagship public affairs program, On Liberty. We'll be talking to Glenn about his latest CIS paper, Failing to Teach the Teacher, an analysis of mathematics initial teacher education. Glenn Fahey, how are you?
Fantastic. That's Salvatore. Thanks for having me on the program. Good to be on this side of the microphone.
Well, it seems like you're alternating week by week. Look, let's start with the basics. What is initial teacher education?
So to become a teacher is actually not a straightforward process. It requires education into the field, it requires accreditation, and it requires registration to be able to be a practicing teacher. So a significant portion of that, of course, is the initial teaching component. And this is where trainee teachers, particularly through university, go and learn all the things that are considered to be prerequisite knowledge to become an effective teacher in the classroom. Typically, teachers will undergo a bachelor program of up to 3 years of bachelor education in a range of pedagogical, subject-specific pedagogical knowledge, as well as broadly understanding theories of learning, those sorts of things that are all relevant to being able to practice in the field, in addition to all of the practical knowledge that is gained through pre-service practicum, these sorts of things. And there's quite a lot of rules around how that all works. It's quite a complex picture, but there's also it's a changing space. So it's not just students that will complete a bachelor's degree these days. You might also complete a master's degree if you've got particularly a subject area specialty. You might do a bachelor's degree in your subject area of specialty, and then undertake a master's degree to get the teaching component. And that's been quite a different shift in preference for pre-service teachers in recent years, who typically did a one-year graduate diploma. So that's ITE in a nutshell.
And tell us about your paper, which is Failing to Teach the Teacher, an analysis of mathematics initial teacher education. What kind of data did you use for this, and what are your basic findings?
So, first and foremost, we wanted to look at we wanted to drill into why is that students' achievement in mathematics has been in steep decline and has been significantly greater in mathematics than the other domains. But of course, it is a across-the-board picture in our education system. But mathematics is of particular concern and has been really contentious in recent years about how to effectively teach in maths. And in common with where a lot of government policymakers have looked to is to see that initial teacher education is a critical space in not only preparing new teachers, but setting in motion a set of expectations for what good practice looks like. And of course, being a really formative part of any teacher's journey is that initial teaching experience. So we thought this was an important area for us to look at. It's also especially important because Australia has quite a large proportion of its teachers who are early career. So that is, we have a very high proportion of teachers with 5 years or less experience. So there's very good reason to believe that ITE is especially important in the Australian context. So that certainly motivated us to have an investigation into, well, what is it that's being preferenced in math teachers' initial teacher education? By and large, this, in fact, let me backtrack a second. To do so, we looked at 31 universities in which we were able to identify quite clearly and in sufficient detail the contents of course unit outlines. And we did a keyword search of those course outlines to try to get a picture of what were the common words, common phrases that were being used. They can give us some clues about the kind of pedagogical emphasis that was being placed in particular units and across different programs.
Now, in my very amateur knowledge of teaching, because of course I teach at the university level where we have no teacher education whatsoever, but I understand from your paper that there are Instructivist and Constructivist approaches to education, not just to math education, but to all education. Can you explain for us what the difference is and why you might prefer one over the other?
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, we're creating a distinction between what is a blurry area, of course, in education, but it's a useful distinction to make in terms of clarifying priorities. By and large, the Instructivist and Constructivist divide comes about based on differing theories of learning. Now, a constructivist theory of learning is largely inspired by constructivist ideas, and the idea that individual students can construct their own meaning toward learning, and this therefore necessitates instruction that is more student-led. On the alternative side is a constructivist idea, which largely places a dominant role for teachers to lead instruction and focuses on the inability of a student, or more generally a novice learner, someone who's not familiar with some content, which technically is something that's a biologically secondary piece of information, that they need the instructor to teach them. And this, not surprisingly, an instructivist theory of learning necessitates a greater role for teachers to lead instruction compared to a more student-led approach.
We have Wade and Anthony in the chat, both of whom say hi and say they've already read the paper and loved it. So kudos to you on the paper. When you're talking about an instructivist approach, it sounds to me like that's a lot more work for the teacher, whereas the constructive approach seems to offload some of that work onto the student. Is that an unfair criticism of constructivism, or is that really what you're saying in the paper?
Look, in the defense of constructivist educators, there's no malign intent. Let me be very clear. Teachers that promote and practice a more constructivist approach genuinely believe that they are incorporating best knowledge about what the most effective practices are. So I need to be very clear about that. There's no grounds on which that any educator would practice something that they didn't believe genuinely to be the most appropriate form possible. What we do understand about a more constructivist-led approach is that it's suitable for some students at some times. It's suitable for certain kinds of problems, but by and large, students also need a significant amount of guidance, students of all kinds, and it largely comes through to how we learn new information more broadly. So in the most general sense, when we have information that we call biologically secondary, basically anything that we have not naturally evolved as humans to be able to acquire, we require instruction. We need somebody to help guide us to understand that piece of information. As we become experts of that new information, we no longer require that level of instruction from another party, and we're actually able to guide our own learning and challenge our own assumptions and think more critically. Those are the kind of higher order sorts of skills that we come to associate these days with more or less 21st century learning and other related concepts. So the point really being that there's a time and place for a more constructivist approach, and there's a time and place for a more instructivist approach. But what we can see from our analysis really is that there seems to be an overwhelming emphasis when it comes to initial teacher education in that constructivist side. And I believe this is leaving teachers unprepared to deliver the critical teacher-led instructivist practices that are really essential, particularly in the early foundational elements of teaching new information, which is what education is really all about, is teaching someone new information they didn't know already.
Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're an educational researcher. I'm an educator. I'm very well aware, and I think most teachers are very well aware, that when we have to actively instruct, that requires a lot of preparation on our part, a lot of, well, just sheer work on our part. Whereas when we assign, say, group work or self-directed learning, frankly, that's an opportunity for us to do something else while the students are working. Let the students work on something while we take a break. Now, I know you're not sufficiently politically incorrect to say anything like that in your paper. I don't want to imply that you feel anything like that, but I am trying to get at why are teaching programs so intent on having teachers take this constructivist approach? I mean, I get from your paper that they are focused on constructivism. I get from your paper that you believe that's an imbalance that needs to be addressed. But why are they so keen on constructivism?
Well, to be fair on classroom educators, that's how they've been taught. So the reason that they've been taught, which is that I guess that next stage to that question, is that what we obviously know of the last 20, 30 years is that initial teacher education has become the domain of education academics and less so the domain of experienced practicing teachers. Education academics have long taken a more constructivist approach toward understanding of student behaviour and education more broadly, whereas practicing teachers have been a little bit more sceptical traditionally. And I paraphrase significantly. Of course, there's much more grey to that, but by and large, education academics do have an overwhelming preference toward those theories of learning, and perhaps those things are important considerations within the academia, but the translation into practice, I think, is something that actually confuses initial teacher educators who are really, as a trainee teacher, I really want to learn how can I be effective in the classroom? And that's something that consistently comes up in teacher surveys, is that despite having longer degrees, despite having more pedagogical courses under their belts, teachers increasingly say they're underprepared for the real world of the classroom. And that, to me, you can draw a very straight line between that and the obvious emphasis upon university-based education academics that, of course, dominate the ITE program. And I should add that I don't feel that teachers look at facilitating more collaborative and student-led activity as an opportunity to cut corners. I really firmly don't believe that. I think it's that there's a genuine belief that that's, particularly in modern education systems, that the best way that students learn is through their own inquiry and exploration. And it's believed that the most effective way to provide that kind of instruction is to allow students to guide their own learning. And I mean, the other point I should add there is that, particularly with reference to maths, I think it's particularly profound because so many educators are concerned that maths isn't fun, and they feel that students disengage with maths because it's not fun, and that their primary part of their role is to help engage and interest students in maths. And to do so, naturally, they engage in activities that are a bit more engagement enhancing. These are things like applying to real world problems or allowing for students to take more of a lead rather than, the whole drill and kill kind of approach of, let's learn formulas and learn times tables. You can see that a teacher who wants to facilitate greater engagement, at least in the short term, will look to more student-led approaches. Of course, in the long term, engagement comes from having that foundational knowledge to be able to successfully navigate and explore more challenging kinds of problems. So it's short-sightedness would be an unfair characterization, but it's that teachers do see an immediate sugar hit from more constructivist, inquiry-based, problem-based type approaches, and in large part, effectively diagnose that as being effective instruction. But when we look at it in a longer term, that doesn't appear to be the case.
Now, I've been self-indulgent too long. We are a live show, which means we do want to get questions in from the chat, live questions from our viewers. And they've been pouring in. I have a question I'll start with from Peter. At what grade should mathematics start being taught explicitly?
Well, by and large, mathematics is something that we begin to gain competency in different areas of mathematics from a very young age, like reading and like language. It's less well understood, those early foundations toward math. So some of those early competencies are concepts of quantity, that this is more than this, and that there's a relative quantity element, that this is 3 times the size of this, There's elements of numeracy that become, the basic counting that can start very early in a child's development. But of course, there's other more complex things like abstraction, manipulation of numbers, these sorts of things that of course take place a little later in someone's schooling. So it's a complicated question. And I think an important caveat is that it's an area of really important investigative work at the moment, is really trying to firmly understand what the appropriate stage and developmental journey is for young learners around mathematics. And it's something that I can say at CIS is something that is very much firmly in our interest over the next little while, is to better understand that journey that students take and help to bring that understanding to the level that it has become with reading and literacy more broadly.
As I mentioned earlier, several people who are active in our chat have already read your paper, Failing to Teach the Teacher, an analysis of mathematics initial teacher education. And included in that is Wade. Wade has read your paper and has a question about PISA results. And perhaps you could tell us briefly what PISA is, but he says, you noted that Finland has slipped even more than Australia in its mathematics results. To what do you attribute that?
Well, largely the same sorts of things we've just been discussing. If there's any country that has taken a greater turn toward student-led and inquiry-based approaches, the only other place that you could point to is Finland. So it's really no coincidence that both countries have had or shared a similar trajectory. Now, the PISA assessment, it's the Program for International Student Assessment. It's administered by the OECD and run across countries all over the world, not just OECD member countries, but also participating school systems. It's the closest thing we have to effectively a universal benchmark of student achievement. 15-year-olds complete the assessment by and large. And so this is students in years 9 and years 10 in various stages, and different school systems have got different benchmarks for those things. But it's 15-year-olds all around the world sitting a similar test, moderated to be internationally comparable, all those sorts of things. Typically, the domains are reading, science, maths, and also some innovative domains or domains that get shifted into to provide a deeper dive into alternative areas. Why is PISA important? Well, PISA is important because it's quite a challenging test. So it really tests students' ability at the age of 15 of their deeper knowledge of concepts, because it's a more complex kind of structure than, say, like a NAPLAN assessment, for instance, which is very foundational in nature. So the PISA assessment is a critical marker for the likely success of students post-school. And certainly, as CIS members will know from a recent chat we had with our education economist, Eric Hanyushek, PISA results are the greatest force in explaining relative wealth of countries over the long term. So it's absolutely critical that we look to PISA as a marker of educational achievement across the population.
If you go back 30 years in Australia, teacher education was done in colleges of advanced education. It then was transformed into universities, and we now see teacher education occurring in the university system. Anthony asks, do we need to replace these teacher education institutions, that is teacher education in universities, with some other form of teacher education?
Look, it's a good question. And so there's all kinds of alternatives that are considered around the world. So if you look at the teacher preparation programs, which is a more general term than initial teacher education, to be clear, so this kind of covers the broad suite of alternative preparation that might be mostly employment-based, for instance. Generally, what we find is that what makes a program more effective is having high-quality practical training during that preparation period. The level of coursework that's undertaken doesn't appear to be a significant explainer in different outcomes. And that's relevant because in New South Wales, for instance, the government has announced that they will support teachers to have a more flexible entry point to teaching if they have previous work experience. So it doesn't mean that someone just comes into teaching cold and then they're just left at the front of the room and told, kind of work it out as you go. It's that based upon a new teacher's previous experience, you might be able to find some kind of more flexible pathways that are suitable to their background knowledge. And we're still learning what those most effective pathways might be. But what we can see from evidence around the world is that a length of degree and the kind of degree that are held don't seem to significantly explain how well prepared a teacher is. So by alternatively, different programs can produce very much the same outcomes. So the structure of the program doesn't appear to be as important as the quality of training that's provided ultimately.
In your paper, you suggest a system of inspectors, that state inspectors would actually ensure that teacher training programs enforce a set of curriculum standards. Of course, universities cry academic freedom when you talk about that. Could you explain to us what an inspectorate system would be, and what would it intend to accomplish?
That's a good question. So there are quite a lot of additional rules around the regulation of initial teacher education on top of those broader regulatory rules around university courses and accreditation and so on. So it's additional functions other than those that are held by TEXA, for those of the audience that are familiar with it. So within initial teacher education, there are requirements that different courses include a certain number of hours of practical training, for instance. There's requirements about the kind of capstone unit. So there are additional interventions that already exist in initial teacher education compared to the broader tertiary sector. So that's the first point, that there are some differences there. And it's true that there is a potential conflict around the idea of academic freedom. However, universities have known the expectations around initial teacher education for many years now and the disappointment that policymakers of different colours have expressed about the preparation of teachers that does warrant a degree of intervention to ensure that there's better quality assurance. Because it's not just me saying that. The policymakers, of course, say that. Schools say it all the time. Schools say that the teachers that come to them simply aren't well prepared, and they've got limited ways of knowing which teachers are likely to be better prepared than others, because there are very few markers of which programs are better preparing new teachers than others. So it seems to me that despite all of the levers that government and policymakers at state and federal level have attempted to pull around setting around compliance and accreditation standards and the like, ITE providers in universities don't appear to be responding the way that policymakers and educators expect. So it seems to me that we do need to take, we do require a firmer hand when it comes to quality assurance, because the stakes are very high. I mean, the underprepared teachers significantly impact upon student achievement in the classroom and take many more years than to become a fully accomplished teacher. And that's unfair upon those new teachers as well. So in my view, that there is a rationale to see that the quality of initial teacher education is lifted. There's also a question of how best to do so. Now, at the moment, we have very indirect and very subjective kind of ways of monitoring the ITE sector. Some of these are asking teachers how well prepared they are for the classroom, or asking their satisfaction with their university provider, or how well they can articulate in a portfolio how good a teacher they are effectively, or how good their knowledge is of teaching practice and so on against the standards. Now, these are all quite indirect. What we really want to see is that teachers can actually practice what is currently known to be the most effective practices. And if teachers are unable or are not confident in practicing in those forms, well, that's a very good indicator that the program hasn't adequately prepared them to do so. So it seems to me that the best way to see what teachers are practicing is, in fact, to directly observe that. And inspectorates do seem to do that. So in the UK, there is an inspectorate that does exactly that. It inspects ITE providers based upon not just what is taught in the university classroom, but also what teachers are demonstrating in their pre-service classrooms. So this to me, it provides a really good and rounded set of indicators that can point to quality in the ITE sector, and would potentially be a more direct lever for ensuring that responsiveness of providers.
Glenn, we have to wrap up, but I want some very rapid, quick answers from you to a few questions. First, what are Asian countries doing right?
So by and large, what you see is that, and of course we can't have a blanket there, but by and large, some of the most effective school systems focus on memorization. They focus on very firm teacher-led instruction. They focus on more challenging problems for students, and they don't focus as much on applied problems, but on building those foundational blocks.
Okay. Second, should all new teachers have mentors assigned to them?
Mentors make a big difference. It's not a matter of just having a mentor, though. It's about having a mentor who is themselves instructionally effective. That means we need to be very selective about who becomes mentors. And there's a huge dividend to be had from really instructionally effective mentors transmit and result in very effective new teachers. So good mentors, not just having a mentor.
Okay. And finally, last question, how can our understanding of good English teaching or literacy teaching inform our understanding of good math teaching?
Well, yeah, certainly anyone that's followed the decades of debate about how to most effectively teach reading will probably have picked up on some very similar parallels. An obvious one here is a key distinction in the reading element is that what we call the whole language approach to reading really is founded on the idea that simply immersing children in words ultimately will make them good readers. Now, I cut that down for us in the final minutes of this, but what you can gather from that is there's actually something quite similar there between the idea of constructivists in math education, that basically if students are able to participate in enough kinds of problems and are immersed in a range of real-world examples, that they'll also be able to decode the fundamental understandings about mathematical procedures. And like in reading, where that turned out to very much not be the case, so it's also true that conceptual knowledge doesn't translate directly to having the procedural knowledge that students really need to be able to have all the decoding strategies that are necessary in maths to be successful.
Glenn Fahey, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And you can download Glenn's paper, Failing to Teach the Teacher, on the CIS website right now. Thanks also to Nico Malian, our producer. Our executive producer is Max Hawk-Weaver. The director of the Center for Independent Studies is Tom Switzer. I'm Salvatore Babonis. Next week, I'll be interviewing Harry Kazianis, the director of the Korea program at the Center for the National Interest, on the prospects for peace on the Korean Peninsula. We hope you will see us then next week on Liberty.